1, 2, 3. Good day, everyone, and welcome to The Literary Machine. I'm your host, K.O. Lynn. If you're unfamiliar with this podcast, I like to focus on stories from popular media and analyze the effectiveness of the storytelling. I focus on both the positive and negative aspects and offer my own constructive input for the negative ones. Today, I would like to start exploring the Grishaverse series. This will cover Book 1, Shadow and Bone, to Season 1 of the Netflix adaptation of the same name. Before we get into today's episode, I ask you to please subscribe to this podcast and share with anyone you know. I currently have a poll on my website on whether or not I should explore video game stories in greater detail by streaming them. If this interests you, I encourage you to make your voice known. Links will be below. If you've not read or watched Shadow and Bone, be aware that I will proceed to spoil the story of the first book/season. You can find the show on Netflix and the book wherever you buy books. To preface the analysis of this story, I would like to address something fundamental that will be touched upon specifically in this episode. As I'm sure many of you have realized, when I analyze these stories, I only consider the story itself. Occasionally, I reference that audience might factor into why a story went one way or another, but usually I will not acknowledge the creators or their background. I will not acknowledge its influences or history. I will occasionally acknowledge lack of resources that went into the production just because that's so frequently a reason for things being cut. In my opinion, there is very little that can get in the way of telling a good story. Sometimes stories are medium specific, like the video game Shadow of the Colossus. That story was designed to be a video game, and I don't see how they could translate it into another medium, like film, and have the same impact. The game is about questioning your own motivations and why you're killing these giant creatures. Whereas in film, the audience plays a passive role, and it would not generate exactly the same questions. However, there is a beast of circumstances that sometimes cannot be ignored: the traditional book publishing industry. As I'm sure many of you are aware, getting published is hard. It's absurdly difficult. There are likely people who have spent their lives trying to get traditionally published. The publishing industry is, of course, in the business of making money, and so they don't want to bother spending money on anything they don't think is a surefire bet. This is a large reason why self-publishing has exploded, because people no longer have to jump through the publishing industry's extensive hoops to get their work finalized into a book. But if a self-published writer expects to actually be successful and generate anything remotely close to an income, they have to invest in marketing their own book, which is a full-time job and is not conducive to producing more material. And because of this, the vast majority of self-published authors are complete unknowns. Granted, the majority of traditionally published authors are complete unknowns too, but they still tend to be more successful. I digress. Nowhere are the guidelines more stringent for getting published than in the young adult genre. I think this is in part thanks to Harry Potter. Game of Thrones is an incredibly lucrative franchise, but it's still not anywhere near as lucrative as Harry Potter or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because those have much broader appeal. The publishing industry knows that it can make a crap ton of money in the young adult genre if they can hit upon exactly what teens want. They're not interested in making a little money. They want to make every cent possible. This is why Twilight was really popular and was in turn followed by a ton of Twilight clones. The publishing industry simply looked at Twilight and baked it down to, teenage girls crave vampire romances. We need more. Similarly, with the Hunger Games and Katniss, Suddenly, there were a ton of post-apocalyptic clones featuring a female main character, like in Divergent. We are still very much in the girls as the main characters are selling, we need more market trend. And this is where Shadow and Bone comes in. It's a fantasy steampunkish world with magic and late 18th century technology. The heroine is Alina Starkov, a plain girl with mysterious parentage who turns out to be something equivalent to the Messiah. I'd like to recount my first experience with this. I didn't know the book existed. I saw the show come out on Netflix and I thought the trailer was very interesting. I started watching it and I got 2 episodes in when I reached out to a friend whom I knew was watching it also. They recommended the books, so I stopped watching the show. In my experience, I have a tendency to prefer the story in the first medium I encounter it in. I wanted to give the book a chance. I found it, I started reading it, and my disappointment was pretty much immediate. Of course, it's in first person POV. What young adult book isn't these days? Not my favorite, but whatever. I got about 4 chapters in before I asked my friend, "Hey, where are Kaz, Inej, and Jesper?" And my friend tells me, "Oh, they're not in book 1. They're in a second series that follows the original story. The first book of that is Six of Crows." Well, that further intrigued me. I enjoyed Kaz, Inej, and Jesper's part of the show so much that I thought, all right then, this won't be too much of a hardship to read. I'll just continue with the series with Six of Crows after I'm done reading the original trilogy. However, as I read Shadow and Bone, I began to develop the impression that Alina Starkov's story was not actually the story the author, Leigh Bardugo, wanted to tell. However, when you're writing to get published, you can't tell the story you want to tell. It has to fit the mold that the publisher is looking for exactly. You get more freedom to write if you manage to write a hit, which Leigh Bardugo has obviously managed now, and that's probably why Six of Crows exists. Before diving in, I like to give a brief overview of what the story is about. While I can't do a parallel analysis of Six of Crows, because I haven't read it yet, that story is still in the show. So for brevity's sake, I will be doing an overview of the show, not the Shadow and Bone book. Alina Starkov is a cartographer in the army because satellites don't exist. It seems in this universe, if you're an orphan or one of the magic users, a Grisha, you're automatically going to be enlisted in the army once you hit adulthood. Alina has a friend named Mal, who is a tracker. He's good at shooting and fisticuffs. These two have been inseparable since they met each other at their orphanage. There's a huge swath of land that's enveloped in darkness called the Shadowfold. It has split the country of Ravka in 2 and has done so for a couple hundred years. This is problematic because it cuts the kingdom off from its ports, which greatly weakens them and makes them vulnerable to their enemies. Mal is ordered to cross the Shadowfold on a skiff. This is very dangerous because there are monsters called Volcra in the Shadowfold. If they know the skiff is there, they will attack and tear everyone apart. Alina destroys some maps so that her cartography team is put on the skiff with Mal, because that's how important he is to her. The skiff is attacked, Mal is injured, Alina gets attacked by the monsters and unleashes her power. It turns out that she's a sun summoner who can beat back the darkness of the Shadowfold and potentially even eliminate it once and for all. The leader of the Grisha, General Kerrigan, referred to mostly as the Darkling, is a general in the king's army. When the skiff returns, he confirms Alina's power and then ships her off to Grisha school at the Little Palace. There, she meets a few more minor characters, Zhenya, Zoya, and David. As goes with most of these characters, where the hero is trying to learn mastery over their new powers, the teachers are abusive. They're all hardasses who don't care about their charges' mental health or other struggles and just work them to the bone. The worst of these is Bagra, who's all about helping Grisha reach their power at their bidding and also develop their powers so that they can access large amounts of it. She makes Alina the most miserable. Because of Alina's powers, the Darkling dotes on her a bit and seduces her to an extent. But this is young adults, so they don't do the dirty deed or anything. They get pretty close at the winter fete, but the Darkling is ultimately called away. Now, parallel to Alina's story, there is Kaz, Inej, and Jesper. Kaz is the owner of a gambling house, Inej is his personal thief who is very slippery, and Jesper is a fast-talking gunslinger. They live on the other side of the Shadowfold. They catch wind of the Sun Summoner because a noble wants her for his own ends. The nobleman is paying 1 million Kruga for this job. Kaz intelligently finagles his way into being the team that's supposed to kidnap Alina. They cross the Shadowfold, then they do a lot of planning to kidnap Alina at the Winter Fete. This fete is a way for the King of Ravka to show off and for this particular one, introduce Alina as the savior. Everything goes down at the Winter Fete. After the Darkling leaves Alina, Bagger comes along and is like, "Hey, you need to leave. The Darkling is evil." Bet you didn't see that one, audience. Alina puts up token resistance, but then decides that Bagra, the woman who verbally and emotionally abused her for several months, is telling the truth and makes her escape. She crawls into the trunk of a carriage. Jesper sees her do this, gets Kaj and Inej, and they just leave in the carriage. After a day, they try to convince Alina to go back with them, but she decides against it and escapes. The trio try looking for her, but they decide against it when the Darkling and his minions come after them. They decide to go home empty-handed, which is potentially fatal, and they're likely to lose their casino. Alina, however, meets back up with Mal, who tracked her down, and they decide to go after this special stag that has antlers that can work as an amplifier to help enhance Alina's power. The Darkling knows about the stag too. Mal does find the stag, but Alina has second thoughts and decides against killing it. Unfortunately, in this universe, you have to kill the living thing that holds the amplifier to gain access to it. So the Darkling tracked them down and killed the stag when she wouldn't. Then he puts the amplifier on Lena and she becomes his slave. Now he can use her powers against her will. The Darkling takes Alina onto a skiff into the fold with a bunch of different countries' representatives so that he can further demonstrate his power and threaten to turn these other countries into a wasteland. Mal sneaks on board the skiff. Jazz, Jesper, and Inej do too. There's a showdown. The skiff is destroyed. No one who isn't with Alina makes it out alive, so Inej, Kaz, and Jesper have a swift change of heart so that they can make it to the other side of the fold. I went a bit more detailed with this retelling because I have a lot of things to say about some of the events, which I'm sure some of you have noticed. I want to start with the characters first, and nowhere better to start than with Alina herself. She's a country bumpkin. She grew up in an orphanage, though she did learn to read and has a modest education. However, she's out of her depth when she gets shipped to Grisha school because Grisha are seemingly a step down from nobility. She's not familiar with political maneuvering or the social status of her position. This makes her easy to manipulate. In fact, she's a bit too easy to manipulate. At first, she looks like a strong female character. She stands up for herself here or there, and she has a temper. She talks back to the Darkling when they first meet, despite him being of much higher rank. She makes no apologies that she hasn't been raised like nobility. That's all fine and good, but she has some serious agency issues. At first, it's understandable. Specifically in the book, the cartography team are ordered onto the skiff. You can hardly duck orders, so that's understandable. Then she needs to learn how to control her power, so of course she's sent to Grisha school against her will. That's only natural and hardly her fault. But, in the book specifically, I don't think she makes a single major decision the whole time. Bagra is the one who talks her into turning against the Darkling and fleeing the little palace. At first, she's wandering a bit aimlessly toward the Shadowfold with the intent of taking it down, but then Mal tracks her down, and again, book specific, he's the one who convinces her to go after the stag. The only time she really takes her agency into her own hands, to some extent, is when she asks Mal to kill her to prevent the Darkling from making her a slave. But Mal doesn't do it because he's hopelessly in love. In the book, her time at the little palace is mostly summarized. It's recounted to us from a largely passive standpoint. Very little of note happens while she's at the little palace undergoing her training, other than her teachers being mean to her. However, when you compare this to the show, they made some major changes with regards to Alina's agency. In the show, Mal was supposed to cross the Shadowfold alone, but Alina burned maps so that she'd be assigned the skiff. She did something extremely illegal, brash, and risky to get onto the skiff with Mal, but she did it of her own accord. That was her decision. The show also makes a big deal of a scar on Alina's palm. Alina gave herself that scar so that when the Grisha came to test her, she would test negative and be able to stay with Mal. At first, she keeps the scar, but then, after she hadn't heard from Mal while at Grisha school, she decides the sentimental reasons for keeping it aren't enough and has it removed. It might be a small action, but it's still her agency at work here. Heck, even when Bagra is sneaking Alina out of the little palace, Alina goes her own way. Bagra tells her to follow a path and that, I'm paraphrasing, Grisha loyal to me will help you if you take the right fork. Alina glances down the right path and goes, nah, and makes her own way down the left path. Another potentially risky and brash move. It might even be categorized as stupid, but I wouldn't trust Bagra either after all of her abuse. Finally, they switch the decision to go for the stag from Mal to Alina. She decides that it's the right action to take. Just a few of these scenes make Alina into a much more confident and self-assured character. She's still naive. She's still ignorant of what her power and her standing in society is, but she's much less passive, and it comes across far better. There is one detail that made it into the show that is not in the book. Alina is apparently descended from someone who is of a race from a country that's fighting against her country. She gets a lot of flack for it. I find it rather curious that it was put in the show. Is it to make Alina's struggles less two-dimensional and more dynamic? Hard to say, especially after factoring in the rest of the show and the books. It's just not a detail that has any real relevance later in the show. When I first read the title of the general, the Darkling, I thought, I hope that's not a villain. Apparently, with a name like that, it's too much to ask for. He's decently written. Initially, he comes across as considerate and reassuring. He doesn't make fun of Alina for her upbringing or her race. This is obviously a tactic to butter her up and get her on his side, but there's a reason why it works. It's much easier to make allies, or a slave, of someone if you don't treat them badly. All of that said, in the books, he's a straight villain. He doesn't even get any backstory to explain the way he is. All we know is that Bagra tells us that he is the one who put the Shadowfold where it is. It hadn't originally been his intention to carve the country in two, but that's how it worked out. He has since convinced himself that the Shadowfold is a good thing. He decides to use it as an example to other countries and eventually catapult himself into the position of king so that the Grisha may rule forever. The show actually dedicates one part of an episode to the Darkling's backstory. At the time he created the Shadowfold, the Grisha were persecuted and killed. They had to train in secret and otherwise hide their powers. The king's forces hunt the Darkling down and kill a Grisha who was very dear to him. In his anger, he delved into knowledge he shouldn't have and unleashed the Shadowfold to protect the remaining Grisha. Then he took on a new identity and pretended that the one who created the Shadowfold was an ancestor because most Grisha can't live for hundreds of years. He has an easy path of it. Because the Shadowfold is such an unknown entity and threat, he's able to convince the king that he's better off with the Grisha on his side rather than against him. The surrounding countries, as far as I can tell, all hate Grisha and persecute them as witches. So the Darkling is able to make a sanctuary of sorts for the Grisha to evolve and train in peace. Their price is that they are automatically recruited into the army and forced to fight on the king's behalf. The show delves a tiny bit into these politics with a side story involving a woman named Nina, who is a Grisha that pretends to hate the Darkling and all he stands for, but is really his spy. I'll leave her story here because it's quite small and irrelevant, at least for now, with the overarching narrative. Unfortunately, halfway through the show, he drops all pretenses and is also just a straight villain, which is a shame. I would have liked to have seen more complex characterization, but this is only the first season. He has room to grow. Let's move on to Mal Oretsev. He's Alina's best friend and grew up in the orphanage with her. She risked her life for his. He is, of course, the love interest. I'll go ahead and admit right now that I don't care much for Mal. The TV show made him a much more arresting character than the book, so I'll give him props for that. It's certainly a lot easier to sympathize with his struggles when you see his side of the story, which the book didn't show. In the show, his whole perspective is bent around finding Alina again. He volunteers for the absurdly dangerous mission to track Morzova's stag because it will land him an invitation to the little palace, where it's his hope that he'll meet Alina again. He finds the stag and loses his two other friends in the process. He does get to go to the little palace, but he shows up on the night of the winter fete. Alina is too busy, and also not informed of his whereabouts, so they fail to cross paths. Or at least, that's how the show goes. In the book, they actually have an encounter in the little palace. Alina is returning to her room when she sees a group of soldiers and recognizes Mal. She runs up to him in excitement and begins gushing to him. He treats her like a little sister, embarrassing him in front of the dudes. He shoos them away, saying he'll rejoin them later. She's the sun summoner. It's made a big deal in the books and the show that she's basically considered a saint. I'm surprised the group of soldiers didn't crowd around her in their excitement. At any rate, Mal acts all petty and snarky towards Alina and implies Alina is some type of whore for the Darkling's pleasure. This rightfully pisses Alina off, and their friendship is broken. He had no basis for saying any of this. He saw a single brief moment between Alina and the Darkling on stage during a show. You know, something that is staged, and drew all of his assumptions from that. Mal was a jerk of the highest order. When they meet again in the book, he does at least apologize for his behavior, but Alina brushes it off, saying he was right. No, he was not right. He was a terrible friend, and as it turns out, a huge hypocrite. She's had to put up with him having flings with a whole range of women, and she was just supposed to happily tolerate that? But he sees one moment where Alina is thrilled by the Darkling, and the green-eyed monster rears its ugly head. I understand that he suffered, and on the surface level, it seems like Alina may have suffered less. Yes, she has her own beautiful room, Her every need is taken care of. She's wearing fancy clothes and eating good food. But this is an entirely new world that she was unceremoniously dumped into. She's been beaten up, manipulated, misled, misinformed, and abused. In the army, she's allowed to clock people back and get a timeout for it. In the little palace, she runs the risk of making some seriously dangerous enemies. Not that she knows it. As is clear, I'm not impressed with Mal. His and Alina's romance is entirely uninspiring, and I'm not impressed with her obsession with him. And folks, he does not improve in the other two books. Even though I can't speak to book versions of Kaz, Inej, and Jesper, it seems wrong to not at least acknowledge them in this episode, simply because their story is my favorite part of the whole show. Compared to our other three characters, these guys are anti-heroes. They're dynamic, and I would liken their world to Game of Thrones light. They live in a brutal place, and it's demonstrated in the first episode that you either win or you die. The young adult version. It's honestly hard to pick a favorite among them all. They have quirks to draw you in, personality to distinguish them, and, currently, an unspoken history. There are so many ways where these characters can go wrong, but Netflix's adaptation team, and likely Leigh Bardugo herself, threaded the needle to make them interesting and without making them boring by virtue of either being overpowered because of their talents or too perfect. Inej might be my personal favorite because I enjoy her soft-spoken, quiet strength and cunning. While she has rather unscrupulous pursuits, she has principles. Granted, one of her principles is broken about halfway through the first season, but she stands by many of her other convictions, like believing Alina to be a saint, even when the rest of the crew was operating on the unfounded idea that Alina was a fraud. I'm keen to follow her journey through season 2, and especially read about it in the parallel books. I also wonder if she'll ever find her brother. No spoilers, please. On a second rewatch, Kaz nearly beat Inej for favorite. His history remains a lot more shadowed than Inej's. He has some long-standing feud with another villainous character, but went unrecognized by him. It actually led me to the theory that Kaz is a Grisha type known as a tailor, capable of changing his appearance. The Darkling also recognizes him at one point, which also led me to believe Kaz is Grisha. I'm certain I'm way off base here, but it's fun to speculate. I appreciate how clever Kaz is. He's quite good at coming up with ideas and thinking on his feet, a trait I can always admire. He engages in some seriously risky behavior, but fortune favors the bold seems to be his personal motto. Again, I'm very interested to see where the story takes him in season 2 and the subsequent books. Last, but certainly not least, is Jesper. He's funny and also a bit reckless and bold himself. He's a bit more of a comedic character. Just a bit. I typically struggle with comedic characters because far too many stories lean heavily on them for levity, turning them into idiotic caricatures. While Jesper did have his funny moments, he was an equally contributing character in the group. He's not all Flash, just mostly Flash. He seriously came in clutch for the ending. So many of the main characters would have died without his presence. He also happens to be gay and gets a moment with a stable boy, which, damn, get it, bud. I have covered most of the story and some of the smaller moments related to characterization, but now I would like to address overarching plot elements. And I want to start off with Bagra's role in the story. She's the Obi-Wan Kenobi of Shadow and Bone, but where Obi-Wan is a kindly old man, Bagra is the exact opposite. She's a novel person. There seems to be a trend in young adult literature where the mentor character is mean and abusive. I'm tired of it. Haymitch in the Hunger Games had a decent reason with his constant and ongoing trauma trying to coach new tributes for District 12. While it's entirely possible that Baghra may have trauma in her own background that could explain why she's so awful to her students, it's still really tired. You don't get students to learn by being hateful. Spite can be a powerful motivator, but only under certain circumstances. At no point did Alina embrace her power out of spite, which likely would have been to her detriment. Alina had a mental block that was related to her own trauma of being cut off from Mal. She suppressed her Grisha powers so that they could remain together. Even after being effectively kidnapped to start her new life in the Little Palace, that mental block remains. Baghra's solution is to just beat it out of her, constantly hitting her with a switch and saying ugly things like she's competing with Severus Snape for the worst teacher prize. I get it that psychology isn't known in these worlds, and therefore mental health carries an even worse stigma than here, but surely someone would have noticed that students respond better to kindness than meanness. Being kind doesn't mean being lax. It means being understanding. Stop abusing your students. But again, this is why I can't accept Alina's quick turnaround of opinion on Baghra. The show does it better with her ignoring at least some of Baghra's advice, but in the book, Alina switches sides after about 5 minutes of explanation. I could understand if she maybe stops to listen and goes along with it, but otherwise harbors doubts. But she doesn't. She instantly believes Baghra and follows everything she says. I would have liked to have seen a bit more fire from Alina with regard to Baghra. In the show, this moment was in the midst of quite a bit of plot, so I could understand if they just straight up couldn't give the moment more screen time. Book Alina desperately needed more agency, and she needed to push back on Baghra a lot more. This plays further into Alina's naivety about the situation. How does she know Baghra wasn't manipulating her, too? Strangely enough, the Morozova stag is a plot point that gets much more extensive setup in the show than the book. In the show, there are flashbacks to Alina drawing the stag and explaining that she's had dreams of it since childhood. The Apparat, a creepy priest, gets an expanded role in the show, largely to exposit to Alina, and by extension the audience, about the lore behind Morozova's stag, which makes it considerably more interesting and the ending more plausible. So let's go ahead and transition into talking about the ending. The ending scene where Alina, Mal, Inej, Kaz, and Jesper come together to keep the Darkling from winning was pretty well done. I suppose I should give Zoya a little bit of kudos for turning against the Darkling, even if she was a total pill to Alina the whole show. The ending scene in the show was quite a bit more epic than the ending we got in the first book. I am a little irritated that it pretty much ended with Mal and the Darkling facing off because Alina had been nearly killed by this point. Granted, though, the reason they did it that way was not to make Alina a damsel in distress, but because her fight with the Darkling is almost certainly going to be the main feature of the final book/season. And the only way you can have a fight this early on between Alina and the Darkling is for Alina to lose. Because if she managed to outshine the Darkling or put him in his spot in the first book, that would take all of the tension out of the future installments of the story. This way it keeps us more in suspense. At any rate, the show's version of the ending is 10 times better than the book. I did not like the twist with the Morozova stag collar. The book didn't foreshadow it at all. Seriously, I read the book twice and I read it very closely the second time. I saw nothing that suggested that the spirit of the stag could just bestow its powers upon Alina without necessarily dying. The show did a better job of foreshadowing this by virtue of having Alina dream of the stag, which suggests it was always meant for her. In the book, there were no dreams, and the information that the book doled out about the color was scant. Mal wanted to find the stag to get Alina the color, because with the stag's power, she'd be able to take down the Shadowfold. There was quite a bit of talk about her getting the color would save lives, and the Darkling getting it would mean people would suffer. Again, Alina made Mal promise to kill her to prevent the Darkling from using her. That's how serious we're talking here. But in the end, when Alina gets to the stag first, she goes, "I can't kill the stag, which is so innocent and pure. That would be cruel." Then the Darkling kills the stag out from underneath her, puts the collar on her, and uses her power against her. Then, when the showdown is happening in the book, Alina throws an entire skiff full of people under the bus and thinks nothing of sacrificing them to get away from the Darkling. Alina, you need to do better math. I think it might have been a nice change of pace to make the hero do something that most people in the modern world would consider morally reprehensible, such as killing an innocent animal for power. But it's not that she was killing the animal for the sake of power. She was doing it to prevent the Darkling from taking the power for himself. Her intentions were better, and I wish the book and the show had made that distinction. For the book to go back and say, "Gotcha! She actually has the power because the stag granted it to her and not the Darkling," just feels like a total cop-out. In the show, most of the people on the skiff are killed by one of Darkling's Heartrender type mages, so you could easily argue that the show is even worse about making Alina saintly, but at least she's not a hypocrite. Given how different the two endings are, I'm quite curious how Six of Crow handles the ending. I'm not the biggest fan of retcons. Don't get me wrong, retcons are often unavoidable. Story creators are human. These things happen. The problem is when the retcon is really big. The book ending is almost nothing like the show. There is no Inej, Kaz, Jesper, or Zoya. It was strictly Alina and Mal getting free of the Darkling and running away. I do think the show ending is better, but it is kind of odd that it's so different. Inej, Kaz, and Jesper are not characters in the first book, and yet they run into Alina after she escapes the little palace. She ends up climbing into the trunk of the carriage that Inej, Kaz, and Jesper use to escape. She makes to get out, and they're all standing around her because they know she's in that trunk. They ask her to come with them. She says, "I don't think so," and uses her powers to escape. In the book, she didn't meet anyone climbing out of the carriage. The people who own the carriage stopped at an inn to eat, and she just slips away while they're gone. It really looks like the Six of Crows will introduce a fair amount of retconning. Again, I don't generally endorse retconning because it frequently has a habit of introducing even more plot holes as they're trying to patch others. Ill-advised. Think very hard before doing it. However, as suggested by my introduction, I feel like the author was a bit railroaded with the first book of the Grishaverse, Shadow and Bone. I honestly believe that most of the narrative problems aren't due to a lack of skill by the author, but are the result of stringent rules for young adult fantasy. This is largely what I find most unappealing about the traditional publishing industry. There are many reasons to criticize it, like having a tendency to deliberately overlook minority voices such as LGBTQ+, or people of color, because they don't think mainstream audiences are interested in that. But one of my greatest grievances with them is their tendency to accept books and then proceed to make the writer rewrite their own story to the point where they can't recognize it, all to fit in their rather generic mold for fear of trying anything new. I've heard anecdotes from authors who are fortunate enough to land a contract and then have to further jump through hoops to make the publisher happy. That, personally, has no appeal to me, and I'd sooner languish in obscurity than compromise that much on one of my stories. Constructive criticism I can accept, but I won't accept a total butchering of my work. The TV show is the author's true baby, not the first book. The first book is pared down into so much generic mush, it barely stands on its own. The main reason it can stand on its own is the world building that separates it from other young adult fantasy. Just to be clear here, I think the show's great. I mean, yes, it still follows the hero's journey. It has the chosen one trope. It has your Darth Vader, and then Kaz and Nej and Jesper are the Han Solo and the Chewbacca of this story. That's just standard storytelling tropes, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What really makes a story stand out, first and foremost, are the characters. The characters are varied, they are complex, and they are unique. I can only see them getting better and more interesting as the story continues. If you haven't already, do watch Netflix's Shadow and Bone series. It actually does have more detail than the book. I'm not convinced that this isn't the version that the author really wanted to tell all along. The book is more like a blueprint for the show to follow, but I hope, as with this book, that they don't follow it too closely. Join me next time when I cover the remaining books of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, comparing it to Season 2 of the Netflix show. Until next time, this is K.O. Lynn, signing out.